So good afternoon or good evening or simply hello to everybody. I'm Silvia Mazzini and I'm the director of IDSVA, and I'm really happy and honored to be here with you and with our guests. And not only because we have here a great book to talk about by Professor Zabala. He's a friend of IDSVA, a friend and also of students in our community, but also because his book and the conversation around this book is a much needed inspiration, and it lets us radically reflect on our role, engagement, and, if I may add, also a possible task that we might want to embrace. So this is at least the groundbreaking effect, or maybe one of the effects this book strongly had on me. Santiago Zabala is ICREA Research Professor of Philosophy at the Pompeu Fabra University of Barcelona in Spain. And he also collaborates regularly with IDSVA as a dissertation director, independent study director, and other tasks. So thank you, Santiago, for this too. And the book that we discussed today, it's a kind of in line with other reflections on future that Santiago had. He had so many books, so I will mention only a couple of them. A great inspirational book for IDSVA is Why Only Art Can Save Us. So Aesthetics and the Absence of Emergency, published in 2017 by Columbia University. And also in that book, we have a dialogue between artists, and philosophers. I see this dialogue also in this book really strongly. And Santiago also was asked in terms of art and philosophy to be a curator for an exhibition at the Círculos de Bellas Artes in Madrid. And the exhibition was called The Greatest Emergency. So that was in 2024, 10 artworks on emergency. There is also a great catalog there till January this year, I think. So the book that we will discuss today has just been published by Columbia University Press, Science from the Future, A Philosophy of Warning. And there, Zabala, among many other things, explains why philosophers, artists, and artist-philosophers count, I would say. And in their way, they can make the difference. But I'm not starting with spoiling effects. I'm only the moderator. Maybe not necessarily moderate, or if moderate in the terms that Nietzsche talks about overman or overwoman, let's say like this. But in any case, I'm the moderator, so Santiago is here, so he will introduce the book. I can only anticipate now, before asking him to talk with it, through it, that then we will discuss that first with the panelists here. We'll introduce them soon. And then there will be the possibility to continue the conversation with all of you through the Q&A chat. It's not a chat, but it's a kind of where you can post your questions. And please, I'm asking not to use the chat function for this, or also to have conversation among you. That's a kind of a way of being together now through the future, but then not through the chat. So now, Santiago, thank you for being here, and I look forward to hearing from you or from your book. Thank you.
Hey, so thank you very much, IDSVA, for hosting this event. Thank you, Silvia, Simonetta, Martin, for being here, and everyone else who had the time today to come online. At least here in Barcelona, it's a beautiful day. Well, it's almost evening now, but it's still really nice. So, well, this book is at large, and also to the one before, and there are not that many, as Silvia said, there are a few of them. One always should be cautious of philosophers that write too many books. So I try to not to write that many. But this book, I think I really like this book for several reasons. One of them is that I come up with this idea of, let's call it a new philosophy, but nothing new really happens in philosophy. So that's a lie. It's not a new philosophy. It's just a different reformulation of a question that we haven't been having been asking, having been thinking enough about, which is the question of warnings, and in particular, why don't we listen to warnings? And so the book is basically first of all, it's a justification that philosophy is a warning, that it's not a method, that it's not anything else. I think that if we even go through the history of philosophy, we can find out that many philosophers have been really warning us about many different things. And this connotation of warnings is something implicit in the philosophical reflection. That's one thing. The second thing that I try to do in this book is to show how we haven't listened to any of these warnings. Now, I would agree that we shouldn't listen to philosophers warning us about things that are not that important. Maybe we should listen more to scientists, but we don't even listen to scientists either. So there's a sort of a problem here. We're not listening to anyone. So might as well start thinking about what philosophers have warned us about. So we don't listen to which justification of why philosophy is a warning. And I do this through four very important philosophers, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Montevideo, and Alan. And the second part instead is sort of an indication that we haven't listened to any of this warning, and it's with a specific direct connection to that. And in the third, I set up more in a more organic way, a more structured way, what a philosophy of warning actually consists in, and how, as Silvia was anticipating, art and in general the humanities can be the place where we can start to listen to warning. So this is more or less the setup of the book. I insist a lot in the idea that we are in a situation, in a condition now that not only we don't listen to warnings, but sometimes we're even incapable of translating the actual word warnings. For example, one of Giorgio Agamben's last books, two publishers that translated this book on COVID, that came out, I think, in 23, I think, I remember now. The book begins in Italian with un'avvertenza, which there's no other way to translate that rather than with a warning. And both publishers translated that as forward. So, I mean, we're not even capable, even translators or publishers are not even capable of listening to warnings. So this is a serious problem, and I would say it's actually even an existential problem if we consider the fact that we had so many warnings from COVID, that we were warned many, many years ago about it, and we did not listen to it. So the idea of warning is really an existential issue. It's not even, I would say, something that social scientists should be working on. It's something that philosophers should actually begin again to work on them. And this has actually been taking place because if we think about philosophy of plants, for example, or even environmental philosophy, isn't that a warning also? I mean, I don't think those philosophers are actually thinking, maybe some of them are activists as well, but most of them are using philosophy to warn us about the problem of the environment. So philosophy is a warning. And I want to have a discussion with all of you and listen to your questions. I will listen to the questions. So I thought that maybe I could read two passages from the book. One from the second chapter on Heidegger, which is the title of the chapter is titled "Science Does Not Think," which is one of Heidegger's most renowned affirmations, which has been deeply misunderstood. He wasn't going against science. He was mostly concerned with the consequence of thinking in terms like science does. In other words, of how everything has to become scientific today. And the other chapter, chapter 7, said it's precisely one of the consequences of not having heard Heidegger's warning about science. And I take many examples in the book both from actual emergencies that take place, but also from art. And in this case, I take an example from one of Black Mirror's episode, which I really like. So let me read this brief paragraph from Heidegger's in the chapter on Heidegger on what he warned us about, on the idea that science doesn't warn us. So this is on page 34 for those of us who have, those of you who want to look for this afterwards. And I write that if the most thought-provoking thing about our thought-provoking age, as Heidegger says, is that we're still not thinking, it is because the Gestalt, the inframing or framing, has become the essence of technology. As the basic form of technological thinking, and framing is a gathering that concentrates humanities upon ordering the real as a standing reserve, to enact the organized global conquest of the earth, or as Heidegger says in the Black Notebooks, the machination. Technology has the power to conquer nature because the method of modern science has already projected nature as an object calculable in advance. Heidegger's objective is to demonstrate not only that science is the basic form of technological thinking that precludes other ways of thinking, but also that it alienates us from nature, that is, it tears humans loose from the earth and uproots them. This creates an unheimlichkeit condition, one of unkindness or homelessness, and also increase our angst. In other words, our fear, as we are only left with pure technological relationships. So this is a passage from Heidegger's warning that science does not think. And then when you move to chapter 6, which is, as you would see, linked to the second chapter, I begin the chapter by pointing out how the most exciting feature of Metalhead, the 5th episode on Netflix Black Mirror TV series, is the absence of a justification for an empty post-apocalyptic world in which the story is set. The episode is shot in grainy digital black and white and tells the story of Bella's struggle for survival as she looks for supplies in an unguarded warehouse with 2 other survivors. Although it is not clear why or what they have survived, references to wounded friends and empty pig farms indicate they are desperate and afraid of something that is hunting them on what appears to be a rolling English countryside. As soon as they find what they were looking for, which turns out to be a teddy bear designed to comfort a child living in a horrible world, an artificially intelligent dog, Robert wakes up and immediately fires off a salvo of tiny bullets, killing one of Bella's friends. As she flees the warehouse, the terrier-sized, splendidly ledgered cybernetic dog chases and kills Bella's other companion and goes on to pursue to the heels into. We learn in the episode that Metalhead Dog, which can drive cars, open any doors by hacking them with a USB key, doesn't have any discernible thought or motivation beside a pre-programmed logic to kill living beings. The episode ends with a drawn-eyed view of the warehouse and hills full of identical robots searching indiscriminately for any living thing. So in some way, Heidegger's warning is it's seen again. It's depicted in this episode of Black Mirror, which I think is a good illustration of where we're heading, and it's actually also a warning itself. At least I think we can interpret it that way.
Thank you so much, Santi. Also for these passages, because well, it's more than evident. Although this word is a bit of strange in this context, but we will see. Also the connection with the arts and with Black Mirror and other artistic and cultural dialogues that you have in your book. Well, in terms of dialogue, one of your books says that a being is conversation. So now we are a kind of being together. And I am very happy to introduce the other 2 panelists. with me, that you already know who I am. So we have here our president. Thank you, Professor Moro, Simonetta Moro, for being here. Simonetta Moro is also a professor of art, philosophy, and visual studies at the IDSVA. She is a visual artist who exhibits internationally and an artist philosopher who published recently, among others, the Vattimo Dictionary, so in 2023, with the Edinburgh University Press, and her monography, most recent, Mapping Paradigms in Modern and Contemporary Art, Poetic Cartography, 2022. Welcome, Simonetta Moro. And we have here also Martin Woessner. Thank you very much for being with us. He's professor of history and society at the City College of New York Center for Worker Education. He's the author of, here again, a bit of art with us and philosophy. So two of his books, Terence Malick and The Examined Life in 2025. So this year with the University of Pennsylvania Press, and then Heidegger in America, Cambridge University Press, 2011. And well, now we can really start that conversation, and maybe I start now, if I may, with the question, so that then I leave more the room to our the other discussants. And if I may ask this question, because there is another friend of IDSVA who is there in the book in some passages, but in my opinion, that's about interpretation. So well, already the title is a kind of thought-provoking, this paradoxical twisting, science from the future. When I was young, there was Back to the Future. But so, and then we have a quote where we have we can see another twisting, Santiago, that you are doing. I can read that signs are warnings, or maybe actually it's a quote from an interview for you. Signs are warnings, that is, those weak and vague announcements we use to alert others of imminent danger, change, and also hope. Well, this weak and vague, let me think at pensiero debole, so weak thought of Gianni Vattimo, our teacher, or one of our teachers. And my question would be, what do you think? Till what point could we consider also, and if so, how, Vattimo's thought a kind of warning?
Yeah, I do think we can. I think that's actually even. I imagine Gianni would be even difficult for Gianni to imagine that weak thought is anything else than a warning. It's a philosophy that tells us to weaken the big structures that we have, the big theoretical structures that we have, from God, science to ideology, whatever. And so it is. He always presented that philosophy, weak thought, as with a very strong ethical component, meant to in some way save us from those strong structures and from everything that, in other words, his call to weaken even our vocabulary was meant, I think, also to warn us of what would happen if we don't. And I think that many of his books actually warn us of that. I think of Transparent Society. That book is precisely a warning of the catastrophe that was about to come ahead. So I agree. I don't think this book has a lot to do with weak thought, but it does read weak thought as another. It's a perfect justification for me that yes, philosophy it's a warning, and weak thought it's a form also of warning us of believing, for example, too much in something. Actually, the chapter on Nietzsche in my book and the linked chapter to it, I think it's chapter 6, actually points out the danger of fundamentalists. In other words, the danger of believing too much, right? And I show this to several terrorists that have from Breivik to some terrorists in France and Quanon in the United States, that the obsession and beliefs in strong structures have led them to violence, etc. So I think that's also a way weakening the strong structure is also a way of warning us of what we should of what we should and we shouldn't do, and most of all, what will happen if we don't. So that's more important. Yeah. I think that's a very good starting point.
Thank you so much, Santi. By the way, you talked about censorship before as a joke, but technology is a kind of doing this. I don't know if you can do something with the connection. I was able to understand everything, but maybe you can check if something can be improved. I don't know if the others have the same. But thank you for this connection and seeing that in line with the genealogy that you also did with also Gianni Vattimo. Now, as anticipated, is the time for a broader conversation. So with the panelists, so Simonetta and Martin, feel free to open and to unmute yourself. So just
Simonetta, you want to go
Martin.
first, or?
No, why don't you go first?
All right. I have, look, I think I'm really honored to be here, and thank you to all of you for including me. I always like to joke that I'm not a philosopher, and so, hanging out with Santiago lets me think that, I can join the conversation freely, and I appreciate that. But as an intellectual historian who's worked on some of these issues, I have kind of three interrelated questions that I think I would pose for Santiago in relation to this book, which I think, as Silvia pointed out, really does stand on top of the work that he's already done, not just in philosophy and art, but also in hermeneutics and also in political and ethical philosophy too. And I think for people who are new coming to Santiago's work, this is a great entry point if you want to understand some of the other things that he's been working on in the past. And I hope that you'll use this book as a gateway to some of the other things he's written. But I'd like to ask him about the role of the philosopher. And I think Silvia kind of got us in this direction by talking about Gianni Vattimo. I'd also like to talk about narrative and the role of narrative in the arts, but also in philosophy. And related to that question of narrative is a question of what we might call, and Santiago says it better than I will right now in the book, which is existential action. This idea that a hermeneutic orientation towards warnings is not just about creating knowledge or knowing things, but it's about transforming one's being in the world or one's life, and that it requires a kind of commitment. So let me see if I can put that all together in a couple minutes here, and I'm gonna excuse me for reading from my notes so that I can sound more coherent than I just did there. But I think the book's a great contribution to philosophy, but the real breakthrough here, I think, is the way in which Santiago has combined philosophy and contemporary debates about some of the most pressing issues we're facing today, especially in the US, but more globally, obviously. This is a very globally focused book. The climate crisis, the gender backlash, rising authoritarianism, and the threat of runaway artificial intelligence are kind of the most prominent ones. There are other issues too. And I think Santiago's given us plenty to think about, but what I'd really like to comment is on the style of the book. And he mentioned that at the beginning, that this is a philosophical work, yet it's divided into these three different sections. And those three different sections, I think, say something about the role of the philosopher, right? What is it that the philosopher can or should be doing today? These three sections: philosophical warnings is the first section, ignoring warnings, the second section, being warned, the third section, introduces us, the first of these sections introduces us to four philosophers, and they become the kind of framework for the rest of the book. And those four philosophers then get paired to these contemporary issues, or their warnings get applied to contemporary issues. At least three of the thinkers that Santiago studies in that opening section, Nietzsche, Simone de Beauvoir, and Hannah Arendt, pointed in this direction of philosophy as kind of engaged cultural practice, right? Philosophy not as an academic discipline, but philosophy as what Richard Rorty once called cultural politics. And I think Rorty and Gianni Vattimo are two of the big figures sort of behind the scenes. And I'd love to hear Santiago talk a little bit about the way in which they inspire his approach here. So we have philosophy as engaged cultural politics or engaged sort of public intellectual work. And that's different from philosophy as it's traditionally conceived, which is as an academic discipline devoted to the pursuit of truth or scientific wisdom, something like that. Uh, and the other philosopher who's important for section 1 is, of course, Heidegger. And Santiago, even in his opening remarks, mentioned Heidegger as well. And I read Heidegger as somebody who wasn't engaged in the same way with cultural politics or public intellectual work. Heidegger was, even though he was a sort of philosophical rebel, he was very much an academic philosopher. So with these different comportments, somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche, Simone de Beauvoir, Hannah Arendt on the one side, or Martin Heidegger on the other, what is it that the philosopher should be doing in the age of philosophy as warning, right? What does a warning philosopher look like? What are their activities in the world? I would love to hear more about that. Related to this is also some of the figures that show up in the kind of cultural politics sections of the book. And these are figures we don't think of as philosophers. Greta Thunberg, for example. Should we start thinking about Greta Thunberg as a philosopher? Or is there a way in which we can think of Greta Thunberg as a philosopher? Or do we need to keep hold of this distinction between the philosopher as thinker and the activist as activist? Are those separate things? So that's one. What is the role of the philosopher in a philosophy of warning? The second thing has to do with narrative. And given Santiago's really great work, I think this book is terrific. I've written about it in the past, and Santiago knows that. But given his use of the arts in his own philosophical thinking in the past, given the way in which the arts show up in this one, including Santiago always has the best covers for his book because he picks very good artworks to be on those covers. I wanted to ask about not just how art and philosophy can help us think through a philosophy of warnings, but the way in which narrative can think through. One of the really great chapters that I appreciated was a chapter that had to do with narrative medicine and the role of listening in the art of narrative medicine. And it seems to me that literature, unlike even some of the plastic arts and other art forms, that literature is an invitation to a kind of listening and interpretation. And so I wonder if it might be the case, because there's actually not a whole lot of discussion of literature in this book. And I wonder if we should be talking more about novels, say George Orwell's 1984, for example, as kinds of warnings in and of themselves. And so for Richard Rorty and I think Gianni Vattimo, literature was really important as the site for this kind of work. And I wonder if there's a way in which the plastic arts and literature might be both conjoined or divided on the question of how they use narrative or how they make us think of narrative as a kind of listening. I actually went back and flipped through the pages of Orwell's book because Signs from the Future seemed very Orwellian to me, or addressing Orwellian topics. And in the edition I have of it, there's actually a foreword by Thomas Pynchon, the great American novelist. And Thomas Pynchon says in his foreword that Orwell was impatient with predictions of the inevitable. He remained confident in the ability of ordinary people to change anything if they would. And this really gets to a big distinction that I think Santiago makes and stresses throughout the book, which is the difference between predictions and warnings. And I'd love to hear him talk a little bit more about that. And I think literature, especially something like science fiction, for example, gets us into the mode of warning thinking or thinking about warnings as opposed to prediction. Science fiction doesn't make predictions. Science fiction makes warnings. And then this leads me to the last thing that I would say, and it's connected to the role of the philosopher or the public intellectual, connected to the use of narrative or the abuse of narrative, which is the question of the will. One of the great things I appreciated in the last section of the book, especially, is Santiago's suggestion that truth is not enough. You know, the famous phrase is always that the truth will set you free. And I think what Santiago says is we sort of have lots of scientific evidence, for example, about the climate crisis, and yet we do nothing about it. So it's no longer a question about having knowledge or knowing something. It's about actually transforming our way of being in the world. And for that, we need some sort of intensity or we need some sort of pressure. But I think what he's really talking around is the question of will. How is it that a philosophy of warnings relates to creating, establishing, fostering a will to change or a will to be something other? And hermeneutics on this reading isn't just a practice of interpreting texts or coming up with new knowledge. Hermeneutics is about existential self-transformation. And when we address these existential crises or existential problems, perhaps we need a philosophy that changes us. And if that's the case, then I'm guessing that Santiago's next book is going to have to be The Will to Change or The Will to Interpretation. And maybe that gets us all the way back to the very beginning of Science from the Future, which starts with Nietzsche. Maybe we all have to go back to Nietzsche and figure out what the will to change is. Sorry, a lot, but hopefully they're things that you can address on your own time.
Thank you so much, Martin, because this is a lot, but we see that there are so many questions that arise from Santi's book. And before leaving Santi, only one element. I thank you so much for talking about the role of artist and philosopher, because I called it, but here the IDSVA is so crucial, and we never remind other people that we are referring to this term initiated by our founder. So George Smith, that wrote, well, actually 3 books, but much more on the figure of the artist philosopher. So that's simply, I think, I thank you for this conscious or not important point. But we have Santi here with a lot of responses, and not saying maybe answers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin. What a mistake to invite you. I mean, now I have to respond to these questions, which are really hard, but I'm joking. No, these are great questions, and I'm going to try to respond to all of them together, because otherwise it would take too long, and some of them I actually have to think about this. But the role of the philosopher in the history of philosophy. Heidegger had his role. He became rector. It didn't work out, of course. And the idea, and Batten also was a politician, and it worked out, I think, it's better than Heidegger, but it also had a lot of trouble. In other words, I wonder whether a philosopher's role is the one to make sure that whatever role we have, it's a role that has to create disturbance in some way. I insist in throughout the book that a warning is meant to create a change now, right now. It's not meant to create a change in the future. When a physician warns you to stop smoking, it's about stopping today, not about stopping in 10 years when it's too late. Right? So the idea of a philosophy of warning is that it's actually an action to create an alteration right now. And this is why the problem of listening comes in. In a way, this is also a book about listening, or it's an invitation to listen to warnings, because warnings are the ones that we have a serious problem there to listen to. All of this, this idea of the role of the philosopher, I think it's important to imagine what sort of philosopher you are also, because if you're a foundationalist philosopher who works on applied ethics, all of this would not have a lot of meaning for you. If you are a non-foundational philosopher, then probably you will know you will not be doing much more than offering us some warnings of what philosophy you practice, whether it's even analytic philosophy could be. But of course, if your statements seem more like or sound more like predictions, in other words, like science, you will probably not be warning us. You would be just telling us what will take place in the future, and that's it. So the idea of the role of the philosopher, who is also to a certain extent uncertain of his own warning, because warnings at the end are quite weak notions, quite weak announcements. They're not complete. Some of them, obviously, they are based on hard science, like environmentalists do, but also they are not they are warnings that are meant for the future, to change now in order for a different future. So the idea that there is a different possibility out there is where the narrative comes in, because we have to be very careful on what sort of narrative we use in order to talk about what is not there. At the end, warnings are an empty space, are basically an absence emergency, like I said at the beginning. The idea of my previous book, the greatest emergency, is the absence of emergency. It's really a warning. A warning is an absence emergency, which is not there now. Right? It's something invisible. But Hannah Arendt was the one who insisted that we should be try to think the invisible. But the narrative we use to talk about something that is not even there, it's like you pointed out, it's something very, very delicate, because here I think is where politics comes in. How can I, let's imagine a politician nowadays, practice a politics of warning? What will a politics of warning look like? Well, it will imply planning for the next 20 years, probably. Maybe for the other governors that come after him. But it is impossible today to do that. It is what in the book I call the global return to order, to realism, does not allow politicians today to plan ahead. They can barely plan ahead 2 years, right? And this is what creates huge environmental and even existential problems today. So the narrative we use to talk about the future is very delicate. This is why Greta Thunberg, which is sort of an example, a model I use there of activism. No, of course, she's not a philosopher, and I don't think she even wants to be a philosopher. And I don't really care about that. What I do care about is how us philosophers can use that model, or can talk about her, or can envision how others are supposed to use. Because at the end, her narrative, or her, even now, what she did with the flotilla going all the way to Gaza, I mean, we all knew that those were not going to solve the problem or bring enough food. It was pretty clear. That was not the point, probably. The point was to get more people around involved and aware of what was going on. And it worked. So here again, it's a question of pressure and also of will, because what Greta Thunberg was doing was also asking us to become involved in that in some way. So the idea of the will that you point out at the end in your third question, that is something tricky, because I think that the reason why I am more interested in Greta Thunberg's warnings, or even in some artist warnings, rather than in scientists, is precisely because of, it seems to me that they are involving us to a more, let's say, existential level than science. They are able to touch us at a level that science is not able to do it. Right? And again, this is not that we should discard science. That's not the point. The point is that we should actually even begin to take science seriously. I do not think we're taking science seriously. All of this, I think it's, I agree with you that Rorty and Baltimore are behind all of this, and I'm happy that it's evident, that it's clear, because all, at least I think more or less serious philosopher, the first thing he should admit is that where he's coming from. Nobody comes from teachers or certain education, and I think that Rorty, I actually would even go as far as to say that Rorty here is even more present than Baltimore. At the end, Rorty is the one that is asking us to discard in some way philosophy and to engage into art or literature. I do talk a little bit about literature, using the example of Atwood's novels in one of the chapters to point out the society in which we're going. And the next book is not going to be titled "The Will to Do," as you said. It's probably going to be titled. It's actually going to be titled "The Horizonless Society," because this is what it is. This is a society without horizon. It's very difficult today for young people like me, no, not that young, but young people, to envision a future. It's becoming a serious problem, right? And actually, I think it's been going on for a while. It's not that new. So there are many issues there that point that this is, if we are incapable of listening to warnings, well, this is a horizonless society. Society that the horizon it has are definitely not not there. There is no horizon there. I don't think I answered all of your questions, but I did. I promise I did my best. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Santi, because here's also the point, not answering all the questions, but stimulating other questions and conversations. And I'm sure that, so at least my interpretation, knowing her, is that Simonetta Moro has a couple of questions for you, too.
Yes, thank you, Silvia. In fact, I think Martin asked probably 4 or 5 questions that I had written down. And I'm happy that Santiago didn't answer all of them, because it gives me a chance to maybe take one up that Martin put out there very astutely, and maybe go a little deeper into that one. Obviously, you can imagine I will ask about the artist philosopher, partly because I also am not a philosopher, Martin, so we are more than many here. But I think this relationship between art and philosophy is very productive in terms also of your argument about warnings. And yes, my initial question was about how do you see that relationship, especially because you make that very interesting choice to begin every chapter with a film. So, you know, with an art form, which I think Martin very pointedly associates with narrative. And that's a point I didn't quite articulate when I first came up with that question. And then on the cover of your book, there is an artwork. And for me, that is very significant in the fact that you assign a very special role to artists, it seems. Not to say the artists are special, but, you know, there is something there that connects the artist and the philosopher in this, perhaps, possibility to conceive both modes of thinking, which I think art and philosophy share, as a warning, right? And for me, this maybe takes out art of the easy, literal predicament of political art. You know, in the sense that it seems that a lot of art that is being made with a clear thesis oftentimes falls into a very clear message, right, that conveys a certain political message, but doesn't necessarily give a warning. It's more like a critique of the status quo. Like, this is how bad things are, you know. But I wonder if you can say more about if we think of art as a warning, then, which I don't think is something that happens necessarily now, although, you know, one can speculate about that. But in some way, artists have always been the ones who were attuned to what was still yet to be seen in society. So what are your thoughts in terms of how art can act as a warning? And would that call for some sort of the Nietzschean notion of the untimely in a way? So is art that acts as a warning perhaps the untimely kind of art instead of the one that speaks only about the present?
Okay, thank you, Simonetta. These questions are at heart of Martin, so thank you very much. Let me try to respond. Now, I agree. Not all artists are, because of course, when I mean, all of you have written books, so you know that when you write a book, a few months afterwards, sometimes a year, you see everything about your book and everything you see. So everybody's giving me warning. That's what I see now. And it's not true. Some artists are not warning us about anything, or maybe just pointing out the status quo or whatever. Now, just like in the exhibition I created in Madrid, the artists there, or the works of art there, they were there because I consider that they work with the aesthetic theory that I set up. some way, I told some of them, they didn't like it, but I told some of the artists that I invited, I could care less about them, or whatever they said about the work of art, because the work of art in itself has its own value, regardless of what the artist might think. And this actually also happened with philosophical, I defended or I presented or I talk about it. So in this case here that I pointed out, that I even the work of art of Graham that I put on the cover that he kindly allowed us to use, I don't think Graham was thinking about warnings when he did this work of art. I haven't asked him, but I'm pretty sure that he didn't. But I did. It does work for me as a warning. It points towards pointing on the other direction, a real reflection, and I think it worked just fine. Now, the idea that warnings that some works of art might be better than science to warn us is not only because I actually think that some works are evidently clear that they are a warning, but also because they make an example that philosophers of most departments now, I think, is still even worse than what it was when I was at Johns Hopkins. It's basically everything is very scientific, and art will have a very secondary role among academic philosophers for the most part, right? And so the idea, I think, of using art there, it is not necessarily because because art has a value. No, because we also have to be doing those sort of examples in philosophy. I don't think philosophy should be close to only talking about Heidegger and only talking about the ontological difference. It should be related. The ontological difference should be related, or we should be able to translate that perhaps through examples of works of art in order to make a point. So the role of the philosopher, like Martin was saying before, is supposed to be one that engages in art in order to make not necessarily better point, but different points that we are unable to do simply with the tools of philosophy. This is more or less my point. I think art has become today, I mean, we're not going to fault artists for climate change, right? I don't think they are responsible for the paper they use, or that doesn't work. But we could, if we really want to exaggerate, we could fault science for climate change. And it wouldn't work either, because some of them, not all of them, are against climate change, but the structure in which science works today, right? The social structure of science does not allow science to function properly, right? Now, what is the structure in art? Well, it's much more flexible, right? There isn't it's not that structure as science is. So again, art for me represents, to be a little technical now, represent a realm, an event, Heidegger would say, within which we can think in a different way reality or the future. That's basically it. And science also is such a realm within which we can think, and we have to think. Unfortunately, this does not happen. In other words, we are unable to find this different realms through which we can think, for example, a different future. This is what I am hoping to do. This book is meant to create change, to think in different, to propose a different realm, a different structure through which we can envision, perhaps, and that will already be too much, a different future. And the first point to do that is probably to listen to those who are closer to warnings than those who are not. So are scientists, are artists, for example, close to warning? Well, environmental artists sometimes are, right? Sometimes they do some works of art that involve going to the Amazonia or wherever. So this is, I know I sound a little bit pragmatical, but it is not that I don't want to give art all the merit. I want to give it the amount merit it has to have, considering how philosophers in general are incapable, right, of accepting that. I think that someone who is a good example of this is Terence Malick, that Martin wrote an excellent book on him. This is someone that was supposed to become a philosopher. Everything was set up for him to become a philosopher. He was even a student. He knew Heidegger, student of Cavell and everything. He understood that philosophy was not the way to solve in some way or to think today what cinema was. And he did that. So this is what I am thinking. I'm thinking that philosophers also should be being suspicious, and here Rorty comes back, being suspicious of its own abilities. We are not that, we have to make an effort to use different tools from the ones we've been using. This is how I think I see the role of art in this book.
Thank you, Santi, because you are actually giving a warning also to us or to so-called philosophers. I studied philosophy, but I always thought something was missing. So now, therefore, I'm here. So at the IDSVA, I'm so happy that we can combine the idea of artist philosopher. And another nice thing is always generosity. So we still have 9 minutes, so I can maybe ask a couple of questions more before we open to the conversations with the others. And I look forward to the Q&A also with all the participants that we have. And as in your title, I would then start from the future. So I liked a lot also, as Simonetta said, also many questions were similar to Martin's questions and Simonetta's. And I'm happy that you already answered partially one, curiosity questions, and philosophy and arts. I think it's also a lot about curiosity. So what is the next step for you? What are you working for? As Borges said, the point of writing a book is to prepare the next one. So that's, and I think this horizon, this element of horizon is crucial. I agree with you that also we have a kind of, or we were a generation with not that many horizons, or felt this way at least. And this word is, philosophically speaking, but also literarily speaking, very rich, because so in hermeneutics we have with Gadamer, for example, the Horizonsverschmelzen, so the fusion of horizons. I like a lot how Vattimo put that, so that this fusion of horizons, a kind of different views, Vattimo stressed, among others, and this goes in line with what I liked a lot, that you said it's about disturbing our role. So then it's not a fusion as in Hegelian synthesis, or, well, this is also not completely homogeneous, but as Guattari and Deleuze stressed, but it's a kind of maybe also a contrast of horizons, but at least a meeting of horizons. So this let me think of this, the role of hermeneutics. This goes also in line with narrative a bit. The art of interpretation. So in another book you wrote, interpretation is anarchic, so it's also a political action to interpret. The courage of interpretation, how I try to quote a bit Foucault in different way. So I would be interested, you already talk about that in your book a lot, what does it mean then to interpret warnings, or signs are kind of clear and distinct and warning not, but maybe you will want to say something more about this interpretation, which again lets me think of Heidegger, this esse, this being together and the acting in concert. So maybe interpretation, now I put there as a kind of activism. It's also, it's not that you can ask, and nothing against it. It's a very intriguing tool, artificial intelligence, but then I need to read the book in order to interpret. I cannot only read like a kind of summary of the book. I also heard reading as resistance nowadays. So this would be the question. An activist is one who interprets. And the other question maybe is simply reiterating, and now I'm eating the rest of the minutes, so then I stop. But this element of arts is crucial for us too. So that Martin and Simonetta already talked about that. But I like a lot. Maybe there is time, maybe not, for you to say something about. Yeah, I think it's on page 16. I put everything there because I felt the importance for me about that. About the intensity of power. So being to have feelings and not this distance or the engaged position. You are quoting Zizek too, of the philosopher. So really on a different side than this cold, objective, so to say, distance, but a participative, relational, maybe activism. The question would be the first one, interpretation as activism or listening to the warnings. And this one would be maybe participation or intensification. Well, thank you already.
Okay, okay. All right, thank you, Silvia. Actually, let me answer by pointing out something in the book. There's a chapter titled "The Battle of Interpretation," and in that chapter, I talk about this debate that started in The Guardian about how they were interpreting the COP28 deal that they did in Dubai 2 years ago, and there was all this problem about this scholar wrote this article, this letter complaining, and the title of the letter was "A Battle for Interpretation of the Deal on Fossil Fuel." Now, it is interesting that it was all, well, it's a battle of interpretation. In other words, what are they actually meaning by the terms of the agreement? And it's pure hermeneutic. They could say anything they want. And in the chapter, I insisted in pointing out that the problem was not so much the battle of interpretation, but rather the battle of interpretation. In other words, the battle of interpretation implies that interpretation in itself implies a battle. It does not imply a conflict of what it means. No. When you interpret, you are in a battle. You are in a conflict. In a way, you are also practicing an anarchic activity, like you mentioned before. So the point here is that interpretation in itself implies conflict, a battle, and also an alteration, which is something that warnings also aim for. So the idea that we have to be able to interpret properly, and properly does not mean in the right form, but we have to interpret warning, is also meant to imply that, well, listening to a warning or also interpreting a warning implies an effort, right? Implies an effort which is not that easy, actually. It's actually kind of a problem. I mean, if you really listen to a warning, perhaps a warning that touches you, like you want to stop smoking, and responding to it properly, it is not easy. It actually implies even an existential decision. It's something that you actually have to make an effort to do. It is not so simple. Also, because the warning might not be as clear as you think it is. Well, he's talking about how I would feel in 20 years, so who cares? Now, this implies that we also have to use our imagination to listen to warnings. We also have to use we actually have to think, and this is a distinction which I think is vital in the book, the distinction between the future and what is coming, right? So le futur, l'avenir in French. And this is vital because we cannot, warnings are meant, they talk about something that is coming towards us, and that it's coming towards us, and we have to be prepared, right? We have to battle interpretation in order to understand it. It is not something that it's going to happen, and we have nothing else to do rather than submit to it. That's a prediction, right? Like we mentioned before. So that's also the big difference between, in some terms, foundational philosophy and non-foundational philosophy. So if we agree that you will not find love so simple on Bumble just because they will assure you will find love if you go on the app, right? The future there is love, and no, actually it never works, right? Because you don't know what the future holds, right? And the problem is actually what I think is the big problem today is that we do think what the future holds. We do think we know what that holds, and artificial intelligence basically meant to do that, right? To create a situation where a horizon-less society, where we do not need to do the effort of let me hear what the future will come to me. Will I find a girlfriend tonight? Will I find a friend tonight? Will something new happen to me? Well, if we don't have that horizon in front of us, we have a serious problem of, I would say, even of existence, because the question is not whether we will have a future or not. regarding warnings, that we will not have a future if we do not listen to warnings. Now, here is a whole chapter of which warnings, who are we going to listen to, right? And here obviously, we have to go back to Gadamer, where he explains the difference between authority and authoritarianism, right? And so there are certain agencies that have a certain authority, which they have that authority from agencies, public agencies, to maybe even some academics or in general. Well, they have authority because we give it to them, not because they give it to us. Right? That would be authoritarianism. So who is going to give us whose authority should we listen to? Well, that also depends a lot on how much work we do, because once I go to a physician and he tells me that I should change my diet, and I might not be happy at all with that, well, I might go and consult others, right? So when I might see that 4 or 5 agree on the certain diet I might have to hold, with that community of scientists, right? That community, not whatever objective they have, but in other words, the community of them, well, that means that I should listen to them. So, but I do agree, like you said, here it's important to remember that interpretation requires an effort, an anarchic effort, which is actually meant to go against, and with this I finish because I don't want to take more time, even to go against education in general, because in the book, I insist a lot on Greta Thunberg, and in particular on the fact that she went to strike rather than to school. Why would she go to school if the education we have today, obviously not at IDSVA, I mean the other institutions, the education we have there is meant for us not to believe in climate change. It's basically organized for us not to listen to warnings, right? That's education. So should we skip school or should we go? Well, we might be better off not going to school, right? Again, go to IDSVA, go to the others. That's more or less the point. Okay?
Thank you so much, Santi. And actually, reflection on education is also a warning. What does it mean? And the philosopher. So you talked about the community. I think this is the best term in order to introduce now the second part of our conversation. So we already have a question. I can read it aloud, and I ask also the others if you have questions or points to share now, you can start using the Q&A.
Help me.
Button. And this is, oh yes, now it comes another one. So the first question is, what is the role of the viewer for a work of art that gives a warning?
Martin has something to say, perhaps. No?
Yeah,
okay.
exactly. I would say it's also a conversation. Santi is there. You talked about authority, and you are the author. Does the author have authority
I'll take my
or
responsibilities.
not? Exactly.
So
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes.
Again?
What is the role of the viewer for a work of art that gives a warning? We have, we can also discuss together about that. So let's share the question. But in any case, Plato said that when a book is written, then the book, the author doesn't always need to answer. But fortunately, we have Santi that now gives us good examples in answering and responding. Yeah, this would be the first question.
I think that if the viewer understands that or conceive the work of art as a warning, he should listen to the warning. Now, listening does not necessarily mean that you would follow the warning. Listening just means listening, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you will actually do whatever the artwork asks you to do. So I would say that just like with any warning, this is a good question because it points out another feature of my book. I don't really care where a warning comes from. I don't care whether it comes from the World Health Organization or whether it comes from an unknown artist somewhere, or whether it comes from a philosopher or someone else. That's not my point. That's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is which are, of all of these warnings, the one that might work best for me, and might work best for me, and perhaps even for my community. And maybe I can use that one to help my friends understand why this issue, whatever issue it is is important. This is the point. I'm not interested. This is why interest and Gleisner, the director, he pointed out that, well, the movie is first of all a warning. That he actually said that in an interview. And I think that's a good point. And Schneider also did this in one of his books on the Holocaust. He points out that, well, this book is more a warning. In other words, yes, it's meant for the future. So whether a warning comes from science or humanities, I don't see there a big difference. The important thing is that we managed to listen to one of them, right? And that one works, that one pressures us enough for us to become interpreters in the sense that we were talking before, that we actually make an effort to change the course of events, or, like I write in the book, the ongoing global return to order to realism.
I would just add to that. I think that's a really good answer, Santiago. I would just add to that I think throughout the book, you don't treat warnings or art or philosophy of warnings in the fashion of oracles, right? That is pronouncements that people just have to obey. In fact, they're oracles in the way that the oracles were for Socrates, which is something that had to be interpreted. And without that audience participation in the artwork or even in a philosophical warning, it doesn't have any meaning. And I think people here who've read a lot of Heidegger would argue about what Heidegger means in the origin of the work of art. Is the origin of the work of art the artwork itself? Is it the artist creating the artwork, or is it the audience interpreting the artwork? And of course, I think at the end of the day, it's all three things. You need the artist, you need the artwork, and you need the audience to do the interpreting. And to me, because you resist the idea that artists or artworks are oracles giving us the truth that we just have to follow, but are actually invitations to interpretation and conversation, the audience is fundamentally necessary. I think you have a fundamentally democratic conception of the work of art. At least that's what I would put it. But that's because I think you're a follower of Rorty as much as Gianni Vattimo too.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Martin. And I think this is in line with what, so it's important to stress this difference also with the oracle that has to be interpreted. Therefore, as Santi said, there is an effort also in each artwork, by the way, so that if you want to interpret, then you need to invest. Sometimes you cannot sleep because there is something, or you are really taken by an artwork and you think, I don't understand, or there is something, but I cannot express that. I think we all know that with different artworks, that, or you read that one day it means something and the other day something different. Also, Santi in his book also says that what today these warnings tell to us, so it's not in general, but it's situated also in a certain context, so in a community of readers. And then the viewer also needs to decide by themselves what to do. Thank you for this. We are not situating us as oracles. We have a lot of questions here. So I can go now to one that says, in a world where artificial intelligence, climate systems, and social movements evolve faster than our ability to interpret them, can a philosophy of slow hermeneutic warnings still function? Or do warnings now arrive too late to change anything? It reminds me, yeah. And if warnings are meant to break us out of the normal, how does your reliance on classical thinkers and traditional interpretations avoid reproducing the very normality you ask us to escape? I think these are two questions. But yeah. The first question is interesting in terms of so slow, but both are. But I don't know if you need me to read first one and then the other, or was it clear?
Well, more or less. So warnings and that warnings come come too quickly, right? This is one of the
Yes,
points.
exactly. So in the sense, we need time to digest, I would say, ruminate, as Nietzsche said. This is also interpretation when I said you read the book one day.
It's more like the opposite. Warnings arrive too late because the question, I think, asks these new systems are evolving even before we can interpret them.
Okay,
right?
I understand now.
Exactly.
Right. I would say the opposite. So no, warnings arrive too early. On the contrary, they are right there. We have all the warnings we need. We have them right here. They really come up quickly. I mean, we're warned every day. I mean, you open any newspapers online, and warning is a word that repeats itself all over the place. So the problem is that we are constantly warned, and we're warned very quickly. That we listen, that's a whole different issue. But we are immediately warned when, oh, be careful with the latest. So no, I think that in the society in which we live, where artificial intelligence is, I don't know, it's organizing everything so well that we will end up by thinking all the same thing, basically. So disaster, of course, but no, I do think that we have a lot of warnings come up even too quickly, probably, and we don't have enough time, we don't have enough will, like Martin would say, to interpret them, to listen to them. Of course, being able to read properly a newspaper, right, with all the warnings and all the news that they're there, and I'm talking about one newspaper, not 20 like we do, all of us open every day, requires a lot of effort. I mean, it's a lot of time, a lot of effort, and I understand that most of us might not have the time to do that or even the willingness to do it, right? And so the summaries that artificial intelligence might give us, they might be interesting, but they're not going to do the trick, right? It's just like Silvia was saying, a work of art, well, if you don't understand it, you might actually want to come back to it even more, right? It's actually because you don't understand it that you like it so much, right? It's the unknown that interests you more. Well, the same, I think, does happen with a warning, because a warning about, for example, one of the latest that I heard that it's really cool, are upcoming resistance to antibiotics. Right? That's going to be.
Can you repeat that, Santiago?
Very, very big thing. Right? Very, very
Santiago,
big thing.
can you repeat that, please?
Resistance to antibiotics.
Okay.
The resistance
Thanks.
to antibiotics. So that's already something that is happening now, and it's going to become much, much bigger in the next few years. Or even a small blackout. We had here in Spain this summer, we had a blackout, a whole day without electricity, all of Spain, right? Everybody, it wasn't that surprising. I mean, this is something that could happen very easily. Are we ready for that? Have you saved everything on external drives? You should do it tonight. If you don't, we don't do that often. Or print everything, whatever. It's a good idea. So the warnings are there. What is not there is our ability to listen to them. And the problem of our inability to listen to us goes as far as physicians, because the fact that in the example I give, that at Columbia University Medicine School, they are teaching physicians how to listen to their patient. It's a symptom that we have a serious problem, because if the doctors don't listen to us, then right. So, right, it's a good question, but my response is a little radical. In other words, no, we have too many warnings.
Thank you.
I like that. In a way, it's kind of the untimely of the warnings, right? They come too soon. And maybe there's no audience there to listen because.
The thing is that if they come too soon, that also means that they are
not too soon.
Here.
They come early. Yeah.
They come early, but the idea of a warning is to come early, right? It's supposed to tell us, okay, this is what's going to happen. So the earlier it comes, probably the better in general. But the point here is that, we're not listening to them, we're not engaging with them. Fine, that's one thing. There may be too many of them. There's also a problem of fake news and all of that. So all of this requires an active interpreter, right? Someone who is able to, maybe someone like the Übermensch that we mentioned before, that has to be very careful, right? Who is who engage and who also take chances in his interpretation, right? You also have to take chances when you interpret and you, for example, you decide you will write a book about someone, right? You also have to take your chances.
I think this is where there's a really, to get us back to the previous question about audience, I think there's a real connection here between the artwork and the warning, right? The artwork, in some sense, has to create its audience. It has to create a space for an audience to appear to interpret it. And it's in that audience interpretation that the artwork then lives on and becomes fully what it is meant to be. And the warning has to do something. And I think the example of Greta Thunberg that you use in the book, Santi, is really good here, right? That the school strike started with one student saying, I'm going to step out of school. And by the end of the year, you had students all around the world participating. That is, there was no audience until that audience was created by an act of interpretation, which was an existential interpretation. And I think there's some other questions I noticed in the Q&A that I was just scanning, and I think some of them are sort of, how can we sort of assess a good hermeneutic interpretation from maybe one that's dangerous or problematic or repressive or regressive or something. And I think an answer to that might be the way in which that interpretation works, the process rather than the product, right? And it seems to me that people who want to revert to what you call realism or foundationalism, they're always calling us back to a call to order, to follow rules or to follow predictions. Whereas somebody like Greta Thunberg is asking us to imagine alternatives, right? To say, not follow me for these reasons, but come along with me and question because of these problems. And maybe it's that perspective that is worth stressing in the formation of that hermeneutical, existential hermeneutical will, the will to listen, the will to interpret, the will to create an audience that does not yet exist, an audience to come or interpreters to come, maybe. Like I said, I'm not a philosopher, so
yeah,
take
but
all
here
that with a
there
grain
is
of
no
salt.
authority of philosophers. It's a meeting point. And actually, I think this come too soon. So I'm discovering new things that also thanks to the questions and the answers now here, because I come too soon is the overman that Santiago, that you were describing in the chapter where you talked about God's death. So Nietzsche, that, and the madman who is Diogenes, the cynic, actually says, I'm coming too soon. People are not listening to him, but he keeps on searching for the honest man, where he still has to search till now, maybe. But that's the point. So actually, the requirement could be, if in terms of interpretation, that we need to be a bit of overman, so to overcome also the ready-made interpretations. They would be the predictions that come very quickly, and we cannot a kind of having a competition, compete with the being quick of the predictions, because they are logical, they are totalitarian in this way. But the others, they come too soon, and the way is to create the audience, or let create through this dialogue. I think it's a different kind of creation together, right? So with the artwork, it's not that the artwork is imposing the creation of a community, but it's the word. So listening and responding to the warnings could be a creating the community. But yeah, well, thank you for this. It's adding a lot to all the questions. So we have a lot of them. I can ask a question to a question that has been asked twice. So maybe to do that a bit more small, because by reading them, they are to understand, but to reading them loudly, then they are still too long. So there is a great question, but I asked the person that asked this question twice to do that even more short. But we have other ones. One is in the meantime, so I will read that too. There is one about this pedagogy, Santiago. You stimulated reflection on that. So can a narrative connect the teachable moments in learning about and experiencing both art and science?
The teachable and transcendental moments.
And transcendental moments. Yeah.
So how can we teach that moment?
It's now my interpretation of the question. So how can a narrative be embedded in teaching moments? This is how, and the same also in art and science. I asked
It's fine. It's okay. So, right. So how, for example, how can we, so what is education? At least let's put it from a point of view of warning. How can we educate to listen to warning? Well, first of all, education for me is basically different, understanding and learning in a different way. Each class or each lecture should be different. And most of them are, even if they aren't. It's a different time of the year. It's a different year. It's a different students. Everyone is involved at a different level, a different existential level, and it's almost impossible to actually have the same class every year. That's probably one of the reasons why online universities did not work. And I mean, the ones that you just repeated tape class, or the classes that were just they just had whoever was teaching come up again and again every time. So there's a difference involved in education, which is vital. I mean, for all of us, I think we're all teachers or professors, whatever. We know how important it is, the exchange with the students, right? It's actually the exchange where education takes place, not in the necessarily simply in the lecture. So I know that Michel Foucault was always very happy to teach at the Collège de France, because at the time at the Collège de France, teaching was only basically there were no questions. It was just the teacher giving his lecture without interruption for 2 hours, and that's it. And he didn't like that, because that did not engage into the questions, into the conversation that students are supposed to have with. This is what is vital, I think, from a point of view of education. And here also the narrative is involved, because at least when I start my lecture, which are not very good, but still, I always start them by pointing out where I come from. In other words, not where I was born, but rather what is my philosophical background. Because it's not that you come to my political philosophy course and that's it, I teach political philosophy. No, I teach the one that I've been formed to teach, right? So you are involved in the same lecture that you're giving, so you have to actually explain from where you're coming from. Otherwise, giving the impression it's a God's-eye view, that doesn't really work, even though often universities want us to do that, right? So I think that the involvement, the exchange there is with the student, that's where education takes place. And it's an effort, because the idea of creating a different lecture every time requires a lot of effort, right? A lot of effort, because the questions will not be the same, and the students will not be the same as the year before.
Thank you, Santi. It's already the second test that we can take with us today, the philosophers, and a lot of efforts, but fortunately we do have them actually. We have here now two questions if we have time. So one is relating to what we were talking about now, and you quoted Foucault. So we have a question that said, thank you, Santiago. Does your work relate to Foucault's view on solutions and to his claim that not, and then here's a long quote of Foucault, not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous, which is not exactly the same as bad. So now, if everything is dangerous, then we always have something to do. I think that the ethico-political choice we have to make every day is to determine which is the main danger. And now comes the real question. So if so, how would you approach this task of determination? So to determine which is the main danger. So maybe which is the main emergency, or
which is the main warning we're supposed to be listening to. So that would be which is the big warning we're supposed to listen to. That is just like the same answer. It's exactly like asking, so which is the greatest absence emergency there is, right? There are so many probably, but which is the biggest one? Well, the one that we really don't listen to. So the warning that is completely ignored, right? for example, just like the genocide in Palestine was completely ignored in the West, that is the greatest emergency we have. The more it is ignored, the greater it is. So the one that is literally not there, climate change work as well, that's the highest one. That's the first one we should really be listening to.
Thank you.
So I guess artificial intelligence, we're more or less talking about it, so that would be the second on a second level, I guess.
Yeah, which you start the book as you're also reminding us that the film Don't Look Up. So that's maybe don't listen to, that would be the answer. So don't listen to the warnings. Thank you, Santi. Now we have another one. Here is connected then to another book that you wrote. So let's see if we can contextualize that. How does your philosophy of warnings account for historical moments when philosophers and artists fail to warn against emerging authoritarianism or even legitimized oppressive regimes? And what does this reveal about the reliability of hermeneutic philosophy as a tool for emancipation? The question is long. I asked this person to make the shorter, but then maybe we can start with this this part first.
So what? So I don't get it again. I think I did understand it, but can you repeat it again once again?
I reread that because I don't want to interpret that to give the interpretation.
There's a newer version at the bottom.
Oh,
of that.
Yes, but I also I'm reading the newer version now, but that's also longer. So that's the newer that I have.
But I did understand. Just to repeat what you said before.
Yes, I repeat, exactly. How does your philosophy of warnings account for historical moments? So when philosophers and artists failed to warn against emerging authoritarianism and TV legitimized oppressive regimes.
I understand. Okay.
And so what does this reveal about the reliability of hermeneutic philosophy as a tool for emancipation?
Okay, so how do we account for the times that warning were not listened to? Well, we should have listened, and maybe we can look carefully at what was going on in that particular moment for us to completely ignore that emergency or whatever was taken. I think that's good. But then afterwards, the fact that hermeneutic is responsible for that, I don't. There I am.
So how I read the question is that there were really things to warn against, so totalitarian regime and so on, and then some philosophers did not warn us enough about that. So I'm afraid, yeah. And then how can we rely on interpretation? Yeah. That's how I read, but I ask also the others. I don't want to impose my interpretation as the realistic one.
So yeah. Maybe if those philosophers or artists did not warn us of the particular warning or emergency, it may be because they were complicit in it. They were part of the problem. That actually happens a lot with philosophers, right? Heidegger included.
I think that's the question, Santiago, which is how can we ensure that hermeneutic, the kind of hermeneutic existential interpretation you're calling for, doesn't fall into that trap, right? How do we know that hermeneutic interpretation doesn't become cover for authoritarianism? How do we keep it anti-authoritarian? And I think I kind of tried to point in this direction earlier. You know, Rorty always said, Rorty said we shouldn't listen to scientists because scientists hold the truth, in the same way that we shouldn't listen to philosophers because philosophers hold the truth. We should listen to these groups of people because of how they work together, right? And so in a famous essay, Rorty writes about science as solidarity. And so if we can think of a collaborative, democratic form of listening and communication and interpretation, the results of that might be less authoritarian or less susceptible, perhaps, to authoritarianism or repressive regimes or something like that. That would be my answer. I don't know. I think you coming maybe from Gianni Vattimo's perspective and maybe from a more orthodox, not orthodox, but a more Heideggerian perspective might say something slightly different. But I would emphasize the process over
Well,
the warning, if that makes sense.
right. So interpretation or hermeneutics in general, it's a philosophical stance that goes back a very, very long time. There are hundreds of different hermeneutics. I don't think that Paul Ricoeur is better than Gadamer's or royalties is better than someone else. There are different, throughout the history of hermeneutics, you can read the amount of different perspective and things that have been done with interpretation, from not simply from biblical interpretation or literal interpretation, but also even the existentialist philosopher. There's a huge amount there. And actually, in the first 4 chapters of my book, you will see that I try to defend hermeneutics through the 4 thinkers. Right? Hermeneutics was very, very influenced by Heidegger and hermeneutics in general. So at this point, so which interpretation, well, it depends. It's the one that works. It's the one that is less aligned probably with the status quo normally. If you are a hermeneutic philosopher, you will run into trouble. And if you don't run into trouble, you're not a serious hermeneutical philosopher. That's basically it. A hermeneutical philosopher, it's impossible that it will try to create some sort of authoritarianism, that we would impose the interpretation on others. That would not be a serious or a proper hermeneutical philosopher. A proper hermeneutical philosopher would be the one, in order for there to be a change, that hopefully it's a change that both of us are engaged in. This implies trouble. This implies conflicts. This implies conversation, not dialogue, right? So this is probably what a good interpretation of what I would think a better word than good would be a productive interpretation, would be one that is involved and it's probably is not attached to whatever values it had in the beginning, that it's flexible enough in order to change. That would probably be a good form.
Fantastic, Santi, because you actually expressed the situation we are all in now. So then maybe we are, at least in this moment, all a bit of in trouble, because the conversation could continue and will continue, but we need to interrupt the recording and also the webinar.
If I may just offer.
Yes.
Sorry, Silvia. Perhaps this is a parting thought, but I like what the question and also the answer to that question Martin offered. Well, let's look at the process rather than the individual warning or even the person doing the warning, and see what we can learn there. And what I would say to that question is, I think we also need to keep in mind that artists, philosophers, activists, thinkers, we're all human beings, right? And we can't always predict or not predict. We can't always have the right warnings or warn about everything. So yes, it's true. I think what Santiago did in the book with Heidegger was to focus on the warning, particularly the warning about technology, right? The way science and technology often go hand in hand, and there's a problem of thinking there. But that doesn't mean that Heidegger was perfect in any way. And in fact, there were many blind spots, and we know his personal story. But I don't think that's a reason then to discard every other warning that he proposed to us, like many others. So yeah, it's an imperfect. We are imperfect beings, but maybe that's also our saving grace.
Thank you, Simonetta. And the saving point is also that we are in the interpretation is not a solitude process. So it's a process in community, and there is not a task only to create warnings as a cow with milk, but we are creating while we are engaging in the conversation. So now, and therefore all these imperfections, as you say, and human beings and are not answered because of time and many other questions, they will continue disturbing us and not letting us sleep or eat. And in any case, so if you want to be disturbed, then read that again. I will read that again. And this means being engaged as a philosopher, as an artist, and engaged. The term is not only engagé, so really that I talk about politics, it's being in a conversation, and we will continue that also other times. I thank you so much, Santiago, for being here, for writing the book and
Thank
being
you.
here. Thank you, Simonetta Moro, our president, for being here and giving soul and thoughts to the conversation, as well as Martin Woessner. I hope to see you again also here at the IDSVA. And thank you above all. As we said, the audience is creating the interpretations, as also the artists and the philosophers. So actually the philosophers have to have more problems now. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for disturbing in this way, so quote in this way.
Thank you.
I look forward to it, to continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.